If a team has the best quarterback in football, it wins. If a team has the best player in the NBA, it wins. If a team has the best pitcher in baseball, as the Blue Jays have arguably had in Dave Stieb throughout much of the 80s, it's anyone's guess. Individual baseball players are completely unable to assume superhero mode over the stretch of a 162-game schedule. Stieb's consistent greatness throughout these years was completely lost in the soup. The Jays' win-loss record offers no direct evidence that he was ever here. But for an ace starter like Stieb, this changes once baseball is bottled up into a 7-game playoff series. He will start up to 3 of them if necessary. The man who wants to be in command of everything, who wants to do it all himself, will finally experience the closest thing in baseball to it. Both Stieb and his partner in fate, Royals Game 1 starter Charlie Leibrandt, are arriving with some baggage. Leibrandt is looking to rebound from a devastating playoff loss the year prior, and Stieb is trying to engineer every last throw out of his tremendously overworked arm before it turns the rest of the way into oatmeal. Stieb's story, and it's already one hell of a story, is unknown to an American viewing public puzzled by the sudden emergence of a Canadian baseball team. He's never taken center stage like this before. They don't really know Dave Stieb. They will. In the top of the first of Game 1, Stieb first encounters Lonnie Smith. His story is a story for another time, but it's so spectacular that it's a wonder no one's ever made a movie about him. Stieb retires Smith and speedster Willie Wilson to face who he regards as his ultimate adversary, George Brett. Inarguably one of the greatest third basemen who's ever lived, and in 1985, he's the most dangerous hitter in the American League. By the time both careers are done, they'll have faced each other nearly 100 times. Neither ever really truly gets the upper hand on the other. In terms of OPS, Brett does just a little bit better against Stieb than the average batter. The two have a lot of respect for one another, with Stieb understanding that he can't beat the Royals without beating Brett. Every encounter is a brand new puzzle, he explains. You can't just throw him whatever worked last time. He's too smart. He also says something startlingly un-Stieb, that sometimes the best thing to do is admit defeat and move on to the next guy. Brett, for his part, knows that Stieb's mediocre one-loss record camouflages how dominant he actually is.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about the guy that's pitching against us tonight, Dave Stieb. His record 14-13 is very misleading.
The sports writers who give out awards, they care about wins and losses. Brett has a far more intelligent understanding of Stieb's greatness, and he uses that understanding to smack a double off the center field wall. Stieb escapes the first inning without taking damage, but Brett has sent a message early.
It's also worth noting that in the first playoff appearance of his career, Stieb, who's had the deck stacked against him all season, is seemingly dealt an additional blow. All year long, Toronto's bats have struggled against left-handed starting pitching. And not only is Stieb's counterpart the league's top lefty, but the Royals are also the league's only squad that boasts 3 southpaws in their rotation. And the only righty they're planning to start is Brett Saberhagen, a pitcher of Stieb's caliber. Here in the cauldron of the playoffs, it starts similarly with a quiet first inning for Toronto, despite George Bell producing what has to be one of the very rare extra base hits stemming from a checked swing in baseball history. Stieb breezes through a 6-pitch 1-2-3 second inning, punctuated by Frank White not having a prayer as he whiffs at this nasty 0-2 slider. Just kidding. The real highlight of Stieb's brief time on the mound this inning was a fan who rushed the field to sneak a little lovin' onto him.
It should be known that our protagonist here, a little bit of a dreamboat. Canada loves him. Now Dave's a family man who's not interested in the advance, but he and the Jays later asked the police not to file charges.
Anyway, the Jays then buck multiple season-long trends in providing huge early support for Stieb, and doing so against Leibrandt, who on paper should theoretically be the pitcher they'd least want to face. In the bottom of the second, they score twice, and following another clean frame out of Stieb, the first 3 Jays reach base to load the bases and drive Leibrandt out of the game in the third. They all ultimately come around to score, giving Stieb the unfamiliar feeling of a big 5-run cushion. Brett gets another hit in the fourth, but Stieb continues to keep all the other Royals hitless, so nothing comes of it. After George Bell's leadoff single in the bottom half of the inning, he continues an incredibly audacious game of base running when he tries going first to third on a groundout. It pays huge dividends when a throw by KC first baseman Steve Balboni completely gets away from him and sails somewhere into Guelph as Bell winds up scoring on the play. Once the fifth rolls around, the game turns into a complete pitcher's duel for 3 innings with neither Stieb, who struck out 5 of the 9 batters, including a wicked backdoor slider on Brett that he called his pitch of the season, nor the Royals' Mark Gubicza allowing a hit. That ends in the 8th when Stieb finally allows his first hit to a Royal other than Brett, before immediately retiring the side on the next pitch and calling it a night. 8 of the 9 starting Royals couldn't touch Stieb. The only one who could recognized that this was simply par for the course, a typical Dave Stieb game. In the twilight of a 6-0 game, Kansas City tacks on a meaningless run, but Toronto cruises to a 1-0 ALCS lead thanks to the 8-inning, 8-strikeout, 3-hit, 0-run masterpiece pitched by Stieb in his and his team's playoff debut.
Now, Stieb has to do what he hates the most, sit around and wait. He watches a wild Game 2 from the bench. Starter Jimmy Key is knocked out early, and after several lead changes, the Jays find themselves down a run in the bottom of the 10th when they call in a favor from their fellow birds.
Out in the outfield, the Seagulls are getting very troublesome. They're lighting all over the field and getting in people's way.
A flock of seagulls descends upon the Exhibition Stadium outfield. In the wake of this stirring show of support, Al Oliver knocks in the game-winning run for the Jays.
The throw from Smith. The Blue Jays win it.
You know what? I can hear the doubters now. If they can use bird powers, why don't they do it every game? It's a special ability, okay? They have to charge their powers. They can't do it all the time. Don't speculate on matters you know nothing about. Anyway, having expired their mana, Doyle Alexander and the Jays fall in Game 3, thanks to a punishing performance in Kansas City from George Brett that goes home run, double, home run, single. On just 3 days rest, Stieb takes the hill in Game 4.
In another duel against Lee Brandt, the first inning sees Stieb very nearly blessed with a seemingly impossible second consecutive game of early run support against him when George Bell wallops an 0-1 fastball that covers about 409 and some change of the 410 feet to straightaway center in a ball that pretty much would have been gone anywhere else, but instead is just the longest possible out. Well, that stings, but the Jays' next inning starts off with a leadoff walk, and a Jesse Barfield double puts 2 in scoring position with none out. Most balls in play would score a run here, but 3 pitches and 2 shallow fly balls later, the runners remain where they are, and there are 2 down. After fielding a comebacker, Lee Brandt escapes from that huge jam completely unscathed. God forbid there be back-to-back games of early support for Stieb, who's continued to dominate. With 2 outs in the third, he gives up his very first hit of the game on a weak chopper, and hit should be in air quotes there, as he probably did just beat Willie Wilson to the bag. That call makes even the always mild-mannered Bobby Cox in a slightly unpleasant mood. Instead of being the third out, now Stieb has to pitch to Brett with a man on, but he remains unfazed, and a grounder to Tony Fernandez sends Game 4 into the 4th inning. Again, the baseball gods tantalize Stieb with the novel concept of his team scoring for him, this time with Cliff Johnson getting a hold of one that he definitely thinks is gone, only to be yet another long out at the very back of the warning track. For the next couple innings, Stieb sits down every Royal he faces, including this touchdown that he caps with a behind-the-back spike in the big football game, which draws pure venom from the crowd.
He hit a Pete Rose who spiked the ball on a go-hitter.
In the 6th, Damaso Garcia's one-out double has the Jays in business. Next batter...
Line drive caught by Biancalana, and Garcia is in no man's land.
Well, that business wasn't open very long. Finally, in his 14th inning of the ALCS, Stieb gets in his very first jam after he walks leadoff hitter Lonnie Smith before the first legitimate hit Stieb allows in the game puts runners on the corners with none out and the lethal George Brett due up. Following a mound visit, hands-down Pants Cox decides to intentionally walk Brett in the wake of his 11 total base gain. So let me restate the situation. With first base occupied and none out, Toronto's about to have their ace issue an intentional walk. This is unprecedented. Excluding instances when batters were representing irrelevant runs in the bottom of the ninth or extras, this is the very first no-out, first base occupied intentional walk in a playoff game. Stieb then gets up 0-2 on Hal McRae before tossing 4 straight balls to walk in a run that breaks the scoreless tie, much to his dirt-tossing dismay. It can all so easily unravel now. Despite pitching another gem, he's now losing and the bases are still juiced with none out. But like Liebrandt in the second, he masterfully works his way out of it with a pop-up on the next pitch, followed by an inning-ending double play.
They might get out of it. The Garcia, low throw, got it anyway.
When Stieb next takes the mound, he quickly records 2 outs before issuing back-to-back walks. He shoots a worrisome glance at the still with hands down Pants Cox, who begrudgingly removes them long enough to walk to the mound and remove Stieb, who for the millionth time in 1985 has pitched wonderfully with absolutely nothing to show for it. As he leaves the field and enters the dugout, some Royals fans say some stuff to Stieb. He's got a message right back for him. Since Stieb's gone from the game, that means it's cool for Toronto to score now, which they do with Lloyd Mosby's double giving Garcia a ride home and knocking Liebrandt from the game. A pop-up to Tony Fernandez puts the game to bed, and with a 3-1 series lead, moves the Toronto Blue Jays to the brink of winning the American League pennant.
In Game 5, with a chance to put the series away, Jimmy Key and the bullpen do their part, allowing just 2 runs. The Jays light up starter Danny Jackson with 8 hits, but somehow, none of them result in a run. In what must be an excruciating game for Stieb to sit through, the Royals shut him out to force Game 6. The Jays have to take care of business here. If they do, they'll be able to save Stieb's arm for Game 1 of the World Series and give him a little bit more rest. If they drop another game and Stieb has to drag himself out there for Game 7, in his words, I don't even want to think about it. But while the Jays do get to Mark Gubicza early, they ultimately strand even more runners than they did in Game 5, leaving 9 guys on base. Stieb just can't get a break.
Making his 3rd start in 9 days, the do-or-die Game 7 starts off with a Lonnie Smith base hit, but Stieb responds beautifully by immediately inducing a double play capped by fanning the mighty George Brett on a science fiction breaking ball. During Toronto's first turn at the dish, Willie Upshaw bats with a man on first and gets aboard himself on a liner up the middle that smacks right into Brett Saberhagen's bare right hand, which is kind of an important appendage for him to perform his job. Perhaps now lacking some control, he then plunks Al Oliver on the leg to load the bases, where, you guessed it, they strand everyone. In the second, Pat Sheridan reaches base on a well-placed bunt off Stieb and comes around to score on catcher Jim Sundberg's 2-out flare to right, giving KC a 1-0 lead. That, unsurprisingly, remains the score through 3 innings of this battle between 2 of the league's 3 best pitchers before Stieb allows a 4th-inning, wind-aided solo dinger to Sheridan, who pulls off the unique combo of bunting with the bases empty and homering on back-to-back plate appearances. After retiring the side, the Blue Jays no longer have to contend with Saberhagen, whose hand injury forces him from the game and brings in familiar foe in the league's other top 3 pitcher, Charlie Liebrandt. The first batter he sees is George Bell, who rips a double down the left field line. With a man in scoring position and none out, Toronto again fails to capitalize on yet another golden opportunity. Stieb keeps the deficit at 2, and the Jays again lead off the next inning with a hit which sets the table for Garth Orge to smash what is nearly a tying pinch hit homer, but over in left field the wind isn't nearly as impactful as in right, and it settles into Lonnie Smith's glove. They're able to at least come away with 1 thanks to Upshaw's double into right field. bringing Toronto within a single run of Kansas City as the game moves to the 6th inning. Stieb's command is clearly starting to wane as he issues 2 walks and hits a batter to load the bases with 2 outs. Bobby Cox is visibly concerned about the condition of Stieb's arm amid his massive workload, but after substantial deliberations, ultimately chooses to leave him in to face Jim Sundberg to get just 1 more out and escape the jam. But Sundberg's able to make contact on a 1-0 fastball that'd ordinarily be a routine pop fly to right, the exact spot where, instead, those heavy winds keep it sailing and plops precisely on the top of the fence before bouncing back into the field of play in what turns out to be a 3-run triple. This is an incredible relic. To this day, it remains the only bases-loaded triple ever hit by a catcher in MLB postseason history. But, with an assist from Mother Nature, the rarest possible event occurred at the worst possible time.
And that's the end of the season for Dave Stieb, and a few minutes later for his teammates too. Once up 3-1, they've blown it. Sundberg's batted ball is about half an inch away from Grand Slam. The fates, after robbing Dave Stieb blind, toss him a nickel. I learned then what it is to die a little. He'll soon write. The Royals end up winning the World Series in 1985, and their 21-year-old prodigy, Brett Saberhagen, takes home the Cy Young Award. Saberhagen was a deserving winner. For the first time in years, we can't honestly claim that Stieb was robbed. But he was just about as good as Saberhagen, and it's obvious that if Stieb hadn't been staked to a mediocre 14-13 record, the voters wouldn't have sat him all the way back here at the kids' table. It certainly also can't help matters that these voters are, of course, sports writers who regard Stieb as a jerk, which he often is, at least to them. Dave Stieb has an image problem, and in the 80s there are limited avenues outside of the press in which athletes can express themselves. You could write a book. You could record a supremely embarrassing rap video. No? Book it is. In 1986, Dave Stieb went and published his autobiography before his 30th birthday. But what have we been saying about this guy? What has he demonstrated time and time again? This was a guy who signed a pro contract as a pitcher with next to no pitching experience and figured he'd just learn how to pitch in the minors. A guy who showed up a veteran teammate with way more experience because he'd internalized that he just knew better. A guy who developed his skills so staggeringly quickly that he exposed the flaws in baseball's free agency system. And consequently, a guy who bucked every convention and became perhaps the youngest player ever to demand a trade for reasons related to money. He does not care about any timetable but his own. Given the results, why the hell would he? In case you're wondering whether it's unprecedented for a 29-year-old player to publish an autobiography, yeah, it kinda is. It's tough to track every memoir ever published by a ball player, but we're satisfied with this sample of 75 others. Most players drop their book well after they retired, often decades later. And of the few who did write them while they were playing, most are superstars, household names like Reggie Jackson or Cal Ripken. The only others bold enough to publish an autobiography in their 20s were digging at some superseding theme. Jim Pearsall wrote about his battles with mental health, and Josh Hamilton about his struggles with substance abuse. Dirk Hayhurst's book was less a conventional autobiography and more a window into what the life of a minor leaguer is like. If we remove those three and focus instead on the books that are fundamentally I'm a baseball guy and this is my story, Stieb is all by himself. What I find most fascinating about this book, though, is that it could have promised one of those unique angles. I mean, we can't shut up about the fact that Stieb didn't learn how to pitch until his 20s. It's absurd. That should be to sell. That should be the entire point of the book, but neither Stieb nor his co-author, Kevin Boland, really dwell on that much. It's mentioned, yes, but at no point does he even seem the least bit surprised by his cartoonish, Henry Rowengartner-esque ascent into baseball's top echelon. He just takes it as a given. He never once questions whether he belongs or what he deserves. Although this book was written many years too early, it's not too bad for what it is. Thanks in large part, I'm sure, to Boland, who's possibly the only writer Stieb likes talking to, there are some pretty fun flourishes. It's a short book, and there aren't any real bombshells in here, but he has a few genuinely interesting things to say. This is a man who knows he's kind of a dick sometimes, and he really is working on it. When he's wrong, he knows he's wrong, and he owns up and apologizes for it. The Dave Stieb of the mid-'80s is trying to find the balance between allowing his competitive energy to burn him up and letting it extinguish. He wants to harvest the energy from that hum of the tens of thousands of people watching his every move, and pour it all into his arm without spilling a drop. He can't waste it. This turn of phrase is definitely Boland's, but the sentiment is Stieb's. Cast out the devils after all, and the angels just might go too. It's corny, whatever, I like it. Most profound is his introspection into why he is the way he is. If y'all would open your scripture please to page 150. He grew up as an outfielder, a hitter. You as the hitter are the active party. When the ball smacks into play, wherever it ends up, you were the one to put it there. That is the relationship with baseball he had always had. But Stieb, the relentless self-governor, the man intent on clearing a new path to greatness that no one had ever traveled and determining his own destiny, chose a profession in which your destination is out of your control. When you throw a pitch, you may as well put it in the mail. You load it up with what you think is the correct address and the proper postage, but the second it leaves your fingertips, you are almost always a spectator. Had he become used to this powerlessness at a younger age, he surely would have accepted it far easier. That right there, that's the story of all of this. All we've seen and all that's ahead. It's the story of a train conductor in search of a steering wheel. Gems like that one didn't appear to catch the attention of any of the writers who trashed the book, though. In fact, reading the reviews, I'm not entirely convinced they actually read it. One, which used more colorful language in the newspaper than Stieb ever did in his book, said it was full of complaints about his teammates, although anyone who read it would know that he told those stories in the process of apologizing and taking accountability for the way he acted. Another dismissed the title of the book, Tomorrow I'll Be Perfect, as arrogance, whereas if you actually open the book, it's pretty clearly an admission that he's not perfect, either on the mound or toward other people, and a declaration that he is trying. One reviewer seems offended by the idea that they robbed him of the Cy Young Award in 1982. After all, says another, how does he think he's so great when he's never even won 20 games in a season? This shit again. Since it apparently bears repeating, the writers in fact did, and this is inarguable, rob him of the Cy Young Award in 1982, and maybe 1981, and definitely 1983, and definitely 1984. Just one of these would massively improve a pitcher's negotiating power. Stieb has lost tons in the way of future earnings because y'all don't understand numbers that have dots in them. Or, perhaps more likely, you do. But you're perfectly fine with abiding by the dumb prevailing wisdom of the time, the one that comically overemphasizes wins, because that's the logic that allows you to dismiss the accomplishments of our main man. He's often a standoffish jerk to the press, that's true. It's not nice, and there's certainly a chicken-egg debate to be had over whether the writer's ignorance toward Dave Stieb fueled his rude behavior toward them, or vice versa. But it's pretty easy to read what they write about his book and get the impression that quite a few of them have an axe to grind. They are gonna love 1986.
From the very outset of the season, it was clear that this wasn't quite the same guy who dominated the American League for over half a decade. Something was off. For instance, in 1985, Stieb allowed at least 5 earned runs in only 4 of 36 starts. But by the time he was just 10 starts into 1986, he'd already done so 7 times, which also happened to be the number that his ERA was approaching at that point in the year, while he was allowing a league-worst OPS of 960. For about the first third of the season, Stieb was turning every batter who faced him into 1999 Ken Griffey Jr. And it's pretty apparent the primary reason for his regression was because of the worsening physical condition of his right arm. He'd spent the offseason working on his changeup in anticipation of throwing it more often, and in the opinion of close observer and esteemed analyst Tony Kubek, this was likely due to the stress that his devastating slider placed on his arm. He had to reduce the frequency with which he threw it, and when he did, future teammate Joe Carter explained that it wasn't nearly as frightening as it used to be. It seems he was undoubtedly also feeling the effects of just how huge a workhorse he'd been for the Blue Jays for years, of how he'd pushed the limits in summoning every ounce of pitching magic that could possibly be extracted from a single arm, and of how he'd kept pushing himself beyond exhaustion, and plowing the unfamiliar ground of mediocrity while dealing with all sorts of persistent arm troubles that would ultimately be revealed to include bone chips in his arm. Stieb's crankiness and blaming of teammates seeped back to the surface. In one instance, he went as far as to suggest his presence on the mound was directly responsible for inferior defensive performances. It was just a miserable time all around for Dave Stieb. While he'd go on to settle down a bit as the year progressed, he finished up 1986 with extremely un-Stieb-like numbers as he entered a chapter of his career in which his body just would not cooperate to allow himself to compete at the level he was always accustomed to, which was the very pinnacle of American League pitching.
In his book, Stieb mentions some of the rivals he most admires: George Brett, Rickey Henderson, Wade Boggs. But a true adversary is beginning to emerge. Detroit Tigers starting pitcher Jack Morris, aka Black Jack, aka Mount Morris, was the supersized version of Stieb in every way. Slugger Kirk Gibson once called these two the two biggest babies in baseball history, but everything about Morris was bigger. His height, his uniform number, his ERA, his reputation as a jerk. There's one story in particular he'll never live down. This might sound familiar. When reporter Jennifer Fry approached him for comment in the locker room, he replied with some supremely misogynist horseshit, just because he could. It's a common defense in these situations to say that he was caught in a bad moment or something. Well, it must have been the longest moment of all time, because in the days that followed, not only did he sit totally content as his teammates and even the team president retaliated against her for reporting the incident, he actively made a point to swing back around and call her a word that I'm sure you can guess. This is the most important difference between these two, who at this point in history didn't yet have major beef with one another, but did trade a few barbs here and there. Look, when all this was going down, I was 3 years old. I was not there. I do not know these people. Only a small slice of what makes up a person is what makes the papers. Stieb was a little rude to the press at times, but I've tried to read everything I could find that's ever been written about him, and I find it impossible to believe that Dave Stieb would ever say anything like that. Left to right, innings pitched, up and down, ERA. On the diamond in the 80s, Stieb and Morris pitched more innings than anyone else in Major League Baseball, more than legendary figures such as Nolan Ryan, Fernando Valenzuela, and Bert Blyleven. When the pitcher of the 1980s debate is had, these are the two who are talked about. Up until 1985, Stieb was the better pitcher of the decade by miles. Over slightly more innings, he maintained an ERA that was more than half a run lower. Even after his brutal 1986, Stieb's body of work was clearly superior. This Z-axis represents pitching wins, of which Morris has significantly more than Stieb. To get them, your teammates have to score runs for you, which again is something you have no say in. Especially not in the American League, where you as a pitcher don't even get to bat. I'm going to do my best to play devil's advocate and defend this silly stat. There is something alluring about the idea of a pitcher going out there and taking full responsibility, win or lose, like a captain going down with the ship. To value the pitching win above all else, you have to believe that nothing matters besides winning. None of that egghead stuff. That is, in some sense, admirable. But it's also totally sentimental. If it's me and my money on the line, and I can pick any pitcher I want to start Game 1, I'm running straight back to those cold hard numbers and going with Dave Stieb without a second thought. This framing admittedly results in some gigantic omissions who arrived a little too late in the 80s to register in the top 10 here, such as Roger Clemens, who didn't show up till 84, and Dwight Gooden, whose godlike 1985 season damn near broke the world in half. So why is this the definition we've chosen? Because it's the definition Morris himself uses when he heads to salary arbitration. And I think we know which statistic he points to.
If Morris really wants to play the pitcher of the 80s card, fine. Let's play that card. We now know that Dave Stieb had a WAR of 38.5 after the 7 years that had been played. No other big leaguer was within 10 of that, and Morris resided outside the top 5 with a WAR barely cracking 24. We can isolate just those two for a year-by-year comparison of their progression, and the cushion is so big that even Stieb's 1986 from hell doesn't move the needle a whole lot for Morris. In terms of what could be looked at the time, 86 did bump Stieb's 80s ERA to 3.27. In other words, still an overall mark that Morris could best in a single season only once. I do not give a shit if Jack Morris had a few more wins per season.
Years earlier, when Stieb went to arbitration, his objectively correct argument that he was a statistically exceptional pitcher fell on deaf ears. He lost. Now, Morris uses caveman logic and not only wins, but racks up the single biggest arbitration win in baseball history. This is not a zero-sum type of deal, of course, the opposite in fact. Morris driving up the price for his services is good news for all pitchers, and he ended up in arbitration with the Tigers to begin with because, when he tested the open market, there were very suspiciously no takers for the top-tier starting pitcher. This served as strong evidence pointing toward a suspicion that was later exposed as fact, that baseball's owners had been colluding against the players. But lest we leave with the impression that Jack Morris was some kind of comrade, let's briefly visit the history of the split-finger fastball. This here's a four-seam fastball, but close enough. It's a little slower than a fastball, and it drops downward as it nears the plate. But crucially, the pitcher uses the same mechanics to throw it. He looks the same, so the batter isn't tipped off and doesn't know it's coming. We can trace the lineage back to pitching instructor Fred Martin, who championed the notoriously difficult-to-master pitch, but couldn't find any takers until he found his ultimate protege, future Hall of Famer Bruce Sutter. Sutter then turned around and taught this dark art to teammate Milt Wilcox. And years later, when Wilcox ended up in Detroit, he passed on this gift to Jack Morris, whose career benefited enormously from it. This is how baseball has always grown and evolved. Wisdom passed down from one generation to another, from one teammate to another, within one big shared camaraderie. It's through these selfless little acts that any sport becomes more and more beautiful with every generation that inherits it. In the early 90s, the veteran Morris is approached by a young pitcher named Pat Mahomes, who's trying to break into the bigs. Both, it should be noted, are in the Twins organization at this time, so they're on the same side. Mahomes builds his courage, goes up to Morris, and asks him if he can teach him how to throw the splitter. According to Mahomes, Morris responds, quote, "Get away from me, you little motherfucker." This is what Morris liked to do. Kick around people he could get away with kicking around because they were on a lesser standing. Every time you do that, though, you roll the dice. One time out of a million, one of them will be asked about any stories they want to tell after their son becomes a Super Bowl winning MVP quarterback. Tough shit there, buddy. At this time, Morris would have been about 35 years old, which is about 33 years too old to be acting like this. But I'm sure he wouldn't have acted like an asshole if he didn't want to end up as the villain in this story. For our purposes, he is Stieb's counterexample. He's the kind of guy Stieb might have become had he not put in the hard, unglamorous work of becoming a more mature, empathetic person. Our hero does not always succeed in this regard. He has his unflattering moments. But again, the point is, he's putting in the effort. He really is trying. And that, in itself, is a very real victory. In 1987, the Blue Jays continue their streak of winning seasons, to the point at which they've nearly broken even since Stieb got here. The trouble is with Stieb himself, who has another off year. Although he downplays it, the bone spur in his elbow, which causes a couple of his fingers to go numb, is pretty clearly a factor. It hurts like hell. But in true Stieb fashion, he postpones surgery to the offseason and resolves to pitch through the pain instead. Amid all the things he'd seen slip out of his control, his pitch placement was the one thing he'd always held dominion over. And now, even that was beginning to waver. Maybe that's why so many begin to notice a change in him. Teammates were startled by how nice he was becoming. One writer describes him as, quote, "not an ogre," which is one of the nicest things they've ever said about him. It seems as though he's been forced to develop patience after having his abilities blunted at an alarming rate. It's either that or let it drive him crazy. This newfound patience is tested in September by Jays manager Jimmy Williams. Jimmy, Jimy, 1M. When he was a kid, he started spelling it that way just to be different. So the man is a born tinkerer, and that's what he does with the biggest star the franchise has ever had. Near the end of the season, with Stieb's ERA hanging at a totally respectable 3.98, Williams yanks away the starting role Stieb has always had and reassigns him to the bullpen. Of course, it's Jimmy's decision to make. He and pitching coach Al Widmer aren't happy with his pitch selection, and he feels that with a playoff race underway, the team's better served with someone else in the rotation. Williams quickly reverses course and returns Stieb to the rotation after just 2 relief appearances, but for a pitcher like Stieb, even a brief demotion is a massive blow to the ego. Ultimately, the move is a fruitless one, as the Jays underachieve in '87 and miss the playoffs again. Early in 1988, the Sun publishes a reader poll asking whether the Blue Jays should fire Jimmy Williams. They do receive 1 no vote from local man Jimmy Williams. This is just not working out. During spring training, he's trying to make reigning league MVP George Bell his full-time designated hitter, which, given his poor fielding ability, makes sense. But Bell refuses. When the DH's turn to bat is announced to the crowd, He just sits there. Ultimately, Bell does get his way, and when he makes a critical and predictable throwing error in July, Williams immediately takes him out of the game as punishment. The two have a little bit of a meltdown in the dugout, rattling the chemistry of a team that's absolutely stacked with talent, and will now finish with a winning record for a 6th consecutive year, and just cannot put it all together. But there is good news. Dave Stieb is back. After postponing surgery, he finally had his bone spur removed prior to the '88 season, and his numbers are approaching what they were in the first half of the decade. Once again, he can throw his slider effectively and go directly after hitters rather than making do with what he's got and pitching around him. And while he won't catch Morris in the wins department, his ERA is comparable to that of the best high-volume pitchers of the decade. All this with an entire season left to go in the '80s. His greatest adventures were still ahead of him. It's August 11th in the Bronx, and Rickey Henderson, now on the Yankees, is being a real pain in the ass. He draws a leadoff walk from Stieb and then steals second and eventually finds his way home. Stieb avoids further damage, but in the third inning, Rickey's at it again, getting on base and stealing second. It's enough to drive you crazy, but this is an older, more mature Dave Stieb, who can channel his frustrations productively rather than letting him eat him up. Jimmy Williams, the consummate meddler, walks out of the dugout. Uh-oh. You do not take Dave Stieb out of this game. You just don't. Not after just 2 innings and 1 run on the board. Over the course of his career to this point, he's been almost certain to stay in the game until at least the 5th, unless he was getting lit up, which today he's not. Just 1 earned run on 3 singles and 3 walks, a totally manageable situation. The only 2 comparable occasions came in 1981 when he was taken out after a line drive damn near blew his hand off, and in 1984 due to a rain delay. Further complicating the frustration of this is that for Stieb, there's a lot of money on the line. His agreement with the Jays stipulates that if he pitches 225 innings this season, he's guaranteed a 1990 salary of $1.4 million. He was in good shape to hit that mark until recently faltering. And while this likely hasn't entered Jimmy's calculus at all, denying him even a few innings deals Stieb a huge blow. Dave Stieb has grown a lot, but maturity is never completed. It's an internal, ongoing project, and sometimes there are more important things in life than maturity. Jimmy Williams continues his walk to the mound. In his book, Stieb described the humiliating pageantry of this prolonged public declaration of his failure. There is no ceremony in any other sport that quite compares with it for sheer embarrassment. Stieb kicks the mound and verbally unloads on Williams before making his exit. Presumably as punishment, for the 2nd consecutive year, Williams demotes Stieb, his staff ace, to the bullpen. As before, Stieb only misses 1 start, but his odds of securing that salary are now doomed. Right after the game, he goes right back to that big red button. For the 2nd time in his career, Stieb requests that the Blue Jays trade him. The tenor is different from last time though, when Stieb angrily demanded to be sent literally anyplace else. This time he's more careful with his words. He doesn't want to rake anybody over the coals. He doesn't even want to publicly criticize Jimmy Williams, as unhappy as he is with him, stressing that there's no bitterness between him and the matter is closed. Again, we see a man who is certainly not perfect, but we see the effort. Predictably, the Blue Jays elect not to trade Dave Stieb. He said at the time he made the request because he didn't have any recourse. But in one very specific, very real way, he did. If you need innings, badly, but your manager can end your day whenever he feels like it, what do? What's the one way you can seize control? What's the one game you could pitch that would render you so completely invincible for a day that no manager on earth would be brave enough to interfere?
On September 18th with Cleveland in town, Stieb's carrying a no-hitter while facing the minimum 9 batters into the 4th inning. This is the part of the game where the prospect of a no-hitter generally starts to register on the periphery of Stieb's radar. It gets broken up on a Julio Franco ground ball that finds its way into center field, but overall Stieb is dominant en route to a complete game 4-hit shutout. Flying high and at the top of his game, Stieb readies for his next start, a rematch in Cleveland on September 24th. Hanging by just a thread in the playoff race, the Blue Jays can't afford to drop any of their final 8 games, and Stieb rises to the occasion, holding Cleveland hitless while facing the minimum 9 batters heading into the 4th inning for the 2nd consecutive timeout. Once again, he has to face Franco to lead off the 4th inning, and after a lengthy battle featuring 3 foul balls with 2 strikes, Stieb walks him.
There he goes again. Julio Franco entered the major leagues a few months before I was born, and when he played in his final professional baseball game, I was 32 years old. In between, the indestructible Franco played for 8 MLB teams in Mexico and Japan and South Korea, pretty much any place he could. Franco was a huge fan favorite wherever he went. He had this awesome batting stance, with his back elbow popped all the way up and his bat pointed directly at the pitcher. It's a stance 10-year-old me spent weeks trying to imitate until giving up because I couldn't use it to hit anything, but he sure could, in particular against Stieb. Of all the AL East hitters who saw Stieb on a regular basis, Franco was one of his toughest outs. Making it worse, Franco played second base, occupying a slot in the lineup where you'd usually expect to see a relatively harmless hitter.
That mini threat is immediately extinguished 1 pitch later on a double play to keep him facing the minimum, and after a 3-pitch strikeout of Joe Carter, Stieb carries a no-no into the 5th inning for the 11th time in his career. After retiring the next 6 batters, he's got one entering the 7th for the 4th time. Yet another 1-2-3 frame leaves him just 2 innings shy of permanently etching his name into no-hitter lore. Stieb's 8th inning begins with second baseman Manny Lee fielding a ground ball and recording an assist for the 3rd opposing batter in a row before the very first at-bat of the game against Stieb that results in something other than a strikeout or a routine out in the field. But 3rd baseman Kelly Gruber still makes a sensational play to preserve both Stieb's no-hit bid and having faced the minimum 23 batters through 7 2/3 innings. He loses the latter when he subsequently hits Luis Medina on a full count and has to pitch to pinch hitter Terry Francona, but retiring him keeps the former alive and well as the game moves into the 9th inning. I suppose at this point it seems reasonable to check in on Toronto's bats this game, especially given Stieb's lengthy history of outstanding pitching all being for naught. Alrighty, that seems about right. Making it even more excruciating is that the Jays had their chances. In the 2nd inning, Jesse Barfield got thrown out at home, and in the 7th, after star first baseman Fred McGriff led off with a single and was bunted over to second, it happened again. Rick Leach lined a sharp single to the shallow outfield, and McGriff was waved home by 3rd base coach John McLaren, where, for the 2nd time, Toronto was nailed at the plate. And to pour salt on the wound, there was only 1 out, meaning had McGriff held up at 3rd, he likely would have scored on any ensuing ball in play. I guess McLarens really aren't meant for stop signs. But, much like Lloyd Christmas, the Jays do get a chance to totally redeem themselves. McGriff again leads off with a nearly identical ground ball single up the middle, is again bunted over to second, and Leach again lines a sharp, shallow single. However, this time, McLaren does throw up the stop sign. When Rob Ducey hits a fly ball to center field, McGriff's able to easily score, finally providing Stieb a single run of support.
Stieb is shooting right through the keyhole. In terms of mathematical likelihood, we're entering the territory of 5% of 1%. He may only need to face 3 more batters to lock this thing up. He's been here before. His failed attempts litter his career like unfinished art projects. But he just keeps getting closer.
3 outs to go, Stieb fans his 8th batter to lead off the 9th inning. 2 outs to go. Up next is longtime ex-teammate Willie Upshaw, and he hits a bouncer toward Manny Lee, who for the 4th time in the last 6 balls in playoff Stieb, smothers it up and makes the throw to first to retire the batter.
26 outs down, 1 to go. Julio Franco takes ball 1. If Dave Stieb were someone other than Dave Stieb, he might pitch around him a little bit, hope he chases something bad, and if not, the worst that happens is a walk, which keeps the no-hitter intact. But we know Dave Stieb too well for that, don't we? He goes right after Franco, putting one in the zone. Called strike 1. Again, called strike 2. Franco now fights to stay alive. He fouls off pitch number 4. He fouls off pitch number 5. He fouls off pitch number 6. He holds off on pitch number 7, which goes for a ball and pulls the count to 2-2. Stieb comes after him again with a pitch on the inside corner, and once again, Franco does not get a good piece of it. It squirts ahead, but well out of the reach of Stieb, who is now the spectator he wrote about. In perfect position to rope in this dud is second baseman Manny Lee, who's playing deep. It is here when Stieb has every reason to exhale, and Lee can scoop it up, throw to first, and put this thing in the history books. It is here when... This is not a bad hop. It's a fucking bloodbath. Manny Lee does every last thing his human body allows him to do, throwing himself into the sky to get his glove on it. He's powerless. Do you remember 1/10 of a second ago when this ball bounced in the infield grass right in front of him? And now falls well into the outfield grass. Base hit. If you were the baseball and you hated Dave Stieb and you knew how many times he'd been denied in every theater of baseball and you wanted to wait until the precise moment you would cause him the greatest misery with 2 outs and 2 strikes in the 9th inning of a no-hitter, isn't this exactly what you would decide to do? Watch it again at normal speed. I must repeat myself. This is not merely a bad hop. Bad hops happen once in a while. In those, the ball bounces in some way the fielder doesn't expect, and it hits the lip of his glove, or at worst in the chest, and even the face. In any event, the ball is knocked down, and Lee would still have enough time to collect himself, grab the ball, and throw Franco out. This one gathered every milligram of chaos it had within itself, to produce an arc that sailed perfectly out of the reach of Lee's outstretched glove. There are 2 theories we can present. Jimmy Williams, who despite his differences with Stieb is heartbroken for him, blames who should often be blamed for innumerable calamities, the Cleveland Browns. Just 5 nights prior, the Browns hosted the Colts on this field, and it's possible that 3 hours of football roughed up the dirt, creating optimal conditions for a bad hop. While a satisfying explanation, it doesn't seem like a likely one. Cleveland Municipal Stadium had also hosted the Jays a night earlier, meaning the grounds crew would have done maintenance several times over. More likely is that Julio Franco had inadvertently built a multi-stage rocket. Watch as he slaps the ball directly against the lip of the grass in front of him. If it lands just an inch short or an inch long, it lands cleanly on either the grass or the dirt, and it probably behaves like a normal grounder. But the lip of the grass does form an angle, however small, which I believe explains the oddly dramatic bounce. That bounce off the first lip of the grass is so precise as to seem engineered. It lands directly on the second lip of the grass. And having clearly demonstrated its ability to wildly alter a ground ball's trajectory just a split second prior, it does so again. A bat in Major League Baseball only caroms this cartoonishly if it smacks directly into some special topography, like the base or a pitcher's mound. Never an open space like this. Even if it didn't inflict itself upon the most important batted ball of Dave Stieb's entire life to this point, I would call it the worst bad hop I have ever seen. It was a moment of such abject sorrow that even Julio Franco himself feels awful. He wants to congratulate Stieb on a masterful game and shake his hand, but he knows Stieb well enough to know that he doesn't want anyone within 100 miles of him tonight. The next day, Franco marvels at how untouchable Stieb had been all game.
Best slider, best curveball, everything was perfect.
But then he continues and sounds like a guy who wants to disown himself of the hit entirely.
He deserves a no-hitter. I'll give him the credit. I don't think he should have booked a no-hitter like that. I was out.
If Franco could alter the history books, he would. But what remains is a no-hitter that was broken up with 2 outs and 2 strikes in the bottom of the 9th inning. No-hitters are notoriously difficult things to research. Fortunately, we benefit from some thoroughly impressive research from baseball writer Stu Thornley, who managed to track down every potential no-hitter in MLB history that was broken up in the 9th inning. He even managed to find the counts of balls, strikes, and outs at the time they were broken up. According to his findings, between 1988 and 2021, pitchers not named Dave Stieb have suffered the miserable fate of losing a no-hitter with 2 outs and 2 strikes in the 9th inning exactly 10 times. Within this same span, pitchers not named Dave Stieb have started 155,303 games, meaning that this happens to human beings not named Dave Stieb once every 15,530 starts. This is how many that is, and this, the very most heartbreaking of fates, is the one that just had to belong to Dave Stieb. Compounding this, of course, is not only that bad hop from another universe, but the fact that Stieb has been in pursuit of this no-hitter for years, falling just short every time. The last one so excruciating that he seemingly had to write a whole damn book just to exorcise the demons. But you know who we haven't heard from? The man himself. The next day, Stieb is asked about his immediate reaction to Franco's hit.
2 down in the 9th inning, 2 balls, 2 strikes, and Julio Franco, and he hits that ball to Manny Lee. What went through your mind there?
A younger Dave Stieb probably would have responded to this question so rudely that they wouldn't have even bothered airing it.
Well,
that you can repeat.
well, it wasn't bad.
But this is a different Dave Stieb. One who can successfully bottle up his competitive energy and use it on the mound instead of taking it out on other people. Even that night, in the immediate wake of experiencing one of the most frustrating lost no-hitters of all time, he stuck around to talk to reporters. "It wasn't a bad feeling," he said. "I just had to laugh. Bad luck." Oh well. Thanks to his newfound hard-earned maturity, these things just don't eat him up like they used to. Rather than obsessing over what he lost, he could instead be happy with what was ultimately a fantastic complete game shutout. Times like these just can't keep him down anymore. It really was remarkable in its own right that Stieb even came close this many times. The vast majority of pitchers never get this close even once. Of course, the real heartbreak sets in once you realize how vastly unlikely it is that you'll ever get this close again. 6 days later. I swear to God, 6 days later, his very next start. Only Dave Stieb. I still can't believe it. Folks, there's just nobody else like him. Since the Jays have faded from playoff contention, this is Stieb's final start in 1988, so he's afforded the opportunity to focus solely on his quest for a no-hitter and burn whatever he's got left in the tank before resting up in the offseason. In front of him is a Baltimore lineup that, at first glance, is more imposing than the one he faced in Cleveland. In the heart of the order are power hitters and future Hall of Famers Cal Ripken Jr. and Eddie Murray. Past them, though, are a bunch of guys struggling to keep their batting average above 200, the bare minimum asked of any American League hitter. If there's any day to try for a no-hitter, it's today.
Plus, as an additional luxury, whereas Toronto hadn't gotten on the board until the 9th inning his last time out, in this one it takes the Jays all of one pitch before Tony Fernandez is standing on third base with a leadoff triple, and just 2 batters in, Kelly Gruber drives him in to give Stieb the early lead. Once again, it only takes facing the minimum 9 batters for him to make it through 3 hitless innings. Once again, the first batter of the 4th inning reaches base, this time via a hit by pitch, and once again, Stieb erases that 1 pitch later on a double play. Another 4 up and 4 down, and by the middle of the 5th inning, he still hasn't allowed a hit to any of his 15 batters faced. He sits the O's down in order in the 6th, leading to his 5th career game with a no-hitter entering the 7th inning, where a 1-out walk represents another slight bit of turbulence, but Stieb personally smooths it out when he flashes the leather to make a nifty grab of a Cal Ripken broken bat liner for the inning-ending and minimum-preserving double play. Now just 6 outs away, the next 6 spots in Baltimore's lineup present only one dangerous bat, Eddie Murray. The 12-year vet came into the game with a career batting average of nearly 300 and is a bigger thorn in Stieb's side than just about any other batter he's ever faced, with 18 hits and 55 at-bats, good for an even better clip of 327. But for the 3rd time today, Murray's quietly retired, nothing but smooth sailing ahead. Quickly retiring the next 2 batters puts Stieb at just 78 pitches through 8 innings and the minimum 24 batters. Considering that in most of his starts he tosses well over 100 pitches, he should even still have a decent amount of gas left in the tank, as, for the 3rd time in his career, he sits just 3 outs from his sacred no-hitter. It only requires another 3 pitches before he gets Brady Anderson and Jeff Stone to ground out, the latter of which Stieb is able to handle himself, retaining some of that precious control and not relying on the fielders behind him. 26 batters in, 26 outs recorded. And then, there was one. For the Orioles' very last chance at the dish, manager Frank Robinson summons the struggling Jim Traber off the bench to pinch hit. Traber has had but a single hit in his last 27 at-bats, in the process dragging his batting average on the season down to .216.
Jim Traber will later author what is perhaps the first ever viral baseball video. It lit up dial-up modems from coast to coast, which is why there are about 12.5 pixels in the entire video. Here, in Japan while playing for the Kintetsu Buffaloes, Traber demonstrates the only real danger he presents to opposing pitchers. One of the many things that makes Japanese baseball so great is that when a batter charges the mound, the pitcher smartly just runs away. This pageantry ultimately ends with Traber diving unprovoked into, 7th or 8th base.
His greatest contribution of late has been in singing the previous night's national anthem, and now he steps into the batter's box as the lone impediment standing between Stieb and his crown jewel. After Franco's fateful hit came on a slider, Stieb's too scarred to go back to that well for the final out, and decides that he's gonna ride this out with his curveball. He starts him off with a couple sloppy ones to fall behind 2-0 before working the count even at 2-2. For the second time in less than a week, Stieb sits one strike away from his no-hitter. After losing it in the most agonizing way possible, at the most agonizing moment possible in his last start, he had to wonder if he'd ever reach this close to the summit ever again. Not only has he's done so in his very next game. It's time to bring it home. After a foul ball, Stieb offers up another curveball down and in that jams Traber up as he bloops a soft flare toward shallow right field that lands just beyond the reach of the leaping Fred McGriff. For the second time in about 143 hours, Dave Stieb failed to allow a single hit through 26 outs and 2 strikes of the 27 outs necessary for a no-hitter, and didn't record a no-hitter. He has no clue how Traber hit it. Traber doesn't really have a clue how Traber hit it. Orioles catcher Terry Kennedy doesn't have a clue how either play that busted up the no-hitters happened. But somehow, they did. Stieb regroups to get the final out on a ground ball to third, but becoming just the second big leaguer in 44 years to pitch back-to-back one-hitters, something that to this day he's the only person to ever do while tangling with designated hitters in the opposing lineups, is of little consolation.
That one, he was strong enough to laugh off. This is too much. It's far too much. Slap some postage on this thing and ship it to hell. It has happened to him twice. The most personally devastating fashion in which a game can possibly end, with your would-be first ever no-hitter shattering into pieces with 2 outs and 2 strikes in the 9th inning, has happened to him twice. A fate that has only been experienced 10 other times over the course of more than 150,000 games, has happened to him 2 games in a row. What are the odds? Well, you remember those odds of roughly 1 in 15,000. Imagine holding a pair of dice, each with 15,000 sides, and exactly one of those 15,000 sides painted red to signify the very saddest possible outcome. You roll them both, and both of them come up red. This is what Dave Stieb has done, and the mathematical odds of doing so are 1 in 241,190,218. 241 million is a quantity that's impossible to fully conceive of, but I think we owe it to the man to try. This is 1. This is 241 million. There's no way to make the assertion I'm about to make with very much confidence, but it's possible that what Dave Stieb has just experienced is the most impossibly unlikely outcome in the entire history of organized sports that has ever come to pass. 241 million, 1. He wrote his autobiography after losing 1 no-hitter in the 9th. Just 1. He just had no idea. He still doesn't.